Hi, it's a gloriously sunny day. It's Sunday, the 13th of September. Welcome to the Gender Speaker live show. Hi, and welcome to the show. And today I'm taking a look at history. I love LGBT history. I got sort of into it when I was doing my master's degree, and then got really into when I was doing a lot of prides in Hull. When we first started the prides back in 2002, 3. There was a lot of work being done then on the history, and I got to know about Stonewall and the whole history there. And somebody said, when did all this persecution of LGBT start? And I thought, well, I'll look that up. Wow, that was an interesting thing, looking up that and finding out where it all started, because I thought it was all going to be something to do with the church and religions and obsessive hatred of anything to do with sodomy, buggery, as they called it then. But it actually wasn't. What I discovered was really, really strange. And I want to share that with you today. I've got a few pictures. I've been tracking through the internet today. It's taken longer than I thought. I hope it's all going to work. So we're going to look at the Buggery Act of 1533, because this was the first piece of legislation in the UK, pretty much the first piece of major legislation anywhere in Europe, that actually made the act of buggery, the act of sodomy, an illegal act. What it actually did was to make the act a capital offence. So I'll get rid of that, and let's just bring up my screen share here, and we'll have a look, and hopefully you'll be able to, I'll put it on the slightly bigger one. Hopefully it'll be big enough to see what's going on with this. The Buggery Act was put together. It was a quite small piece of legislation. There it is. A single sort of page. I'm not going to try and read through that. It's pretty awful, but an abominable act. It made the act of sodomy, whether that was with man, woman, or beast, an act that was subject to a capital offence. You would be hung. But it went worse than that. This was the most severe piece of legislation on the statute books, because in addition to losing your life, you lost all of your assets. So your family was left utterly destitute as everything was taken away. Your house, your investment, everything went. So that was how bad it was. So I thought, wow, that was pretty severe there. But then I discovered that hardly anybody was ever charged under the act. Well, certainly in the early days when it was first put there, it was a 1-year act. It was only in place for 1 year. Then they brought it back a couple of years later for another year, and another year after that. But it didn't all make sense. So let's just have a look at a little bit what was going on. Thomas Cromwell was the architect of the act. He put this act into place, and he was Henry VIII's chief minister. He was also the minister largely responsible for a lot of the work of enforcing Henry's new laws and rules. And he put this act in place in terms of what it did. Now, why was nobody charged? Doesn't make any sense, does it? You put this act in place with a really severe penalty, and yet nobody gets charged. So I couldn't understand that, and started to have a look. Need to look at Henry first and try and figure out, because the important thing about this is the date, 1533, early 1533. I think it was actually about June or July. So Henry VIII, son of Henry VII, had a brother, Arthur. And Arthur was his oldest brother and was due to be married and become the king. Unfortunately, Arthur died at a very young age. But before he died, he had already married Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine was an extremely powerful... back in the middle times of the Tudor times, people traded their daughters in order as part of peace deals. And this is exactly what had happened. Catherine had been traded to Britain by France, through to Henry VII as part of a peace arrangement that, because they were now interrelated, they wouldn't fight each other and attack each other, because the Europeans were very much at each other's throats then. So Arthur died, and that mucked the whole plan up. So what Henry VII then did was to basically say, okay, fine, well, Arthur's dead, so you can have Henry. So Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon. That seemed to be okay about it at the time. He was now going to become king, and in 1509, Henry became king. So what happened by 1533? Well, a couple of things you need to know. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, had a daughter, Mary, had multiple miscarriages, constantly trying. Henry was absolutely obsessed with getting a male heir to the throne, and she couldn't deliver, just wasn't able to. So he said, right, I want this marriage annulled because you were married to my brother, and I think that marriage was conjugal. She said, no, never was. Never, absolutely never was. Adamantly insisted the marriage to Henry's brother had never been consummated, but Henry wanted to get rid of it. And the problem is 1533, but I tell you, Queen Elizabeth I was born in September 1533, the 9th month. So round about the early part, February of 1533, Henry will have discovered that his now mistress, Anne Boleyn, was unfortunately pregnant, carrying his future heir, potentially. He didn't know whether it was going to be male or female then. No scans available. So he needed to get rid of Catherine. But there was a huge, huge problem in the way. And that problem was the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, the most powerful ruler in the whole of Europe, and Catherine's nephew. So if Henry dumped Aunt Catherine, Charles wasn't going to be at all pleased, and he'd just basically taken over. He was the king of Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, Germany. He'd just taken over Italy, and he'd really had a big set to with the Pope. So when Henry went to Pope Clement VII and said, okay, I want to get rid of this, I want this marriage annulled, Pope Clement looked at the possibilities. He thought, I've got the Holy Roman Emperor who's knocking us to pieces and just become king of Italy. And then we've got this sort of stuck-up, this upstart king in England who's wanting a divorce. No, forget it. No way. He refused to annul Henry's marriage. So Henry said, right, that's it. We're leaving the Catholic Church. Sorry, I spelled church wrong there. Never mind. We're leaving the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church owned 1/3 of Britain. They had huge, massive estates right the way across the British Isles. Interestingly, a piece of legislation was in place which enabled Henry to hang any clerics who, somebody mentioned on the grapevine, had been a bit naughty with some of the choir boys. And I know, I go, but it happens. It happens now. It's happened then. It happened way back then. There is a history of the clerics within the Catholic Church being very abusive towards boys, and a history of homosexual activity. So the Reformation began. The first Brexit. Henry split from the Catholic Church, set up the Church of England with himself as head, annihilated all of the lands and properties of the Catholic Church, and took over them and handed them all out to all the barons and various people supporting him and the people he needed to support, establishing the Church of England. And that was it. So, 1547, Henry died. Edward the Sixth came to the throne then. Boy king is only 9 years old, survived until he was about 15, but obviously all of that was being manipulated and controlled by his uncle, and he was the son of James Seymour, or later the male heir that was produced, but he died. He died at the age of 15. He nominated Lady Jane Grey to take over and become the Protestant queen, but Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, was having none of it. Big battle. Mary comes in, staunch Catholic. And this was the thing they were trying to stop. Now, the first thing that happened when Mary got into power was she repealed the Buggery Act. That's the really big clue, that the Buggery Act was being used as a means of being able to kill the clerics. The Buggery Act was the only piece of legislation that allowed the king to hang a cleric, to hang an abbot, to take away their abbeys, to take away their lands, to give them all out. Only that piece of legislation gave him the power to do that. And despite all her attempts to reverse the Reformation, it all failed. Mary desperately tried to get pregnant, desperately tried to get an heir. She survived 5 years, died in childbirth, didn't happen, no heir, and Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne. She didn't do anything immediately, but by 1563, she had reenacted the Buggery Act. She had re-established Britain now as a Protestant country separate from the Catholic Church, and the whole thing had changed. And now the Buggery Act became pretty much embedded in our legislation. It was a very powerful tool she could use to manipulate and manage, just as Henry had, and it stayed in place. It stayed in place for a long time, although very few people in the early days were actually charged under the Buggery Act. Walter Hungerford had been charged with treason. He had basically been supporting a Catholic organisation against the king or against the queen. He was hung for that. It was against the king. It was in 1540. Ironically, on the same day, Thomas Cromwell was also hung for support, for treason. Now, only Hungerford, however, had this Buggery Act charge added on the end of it, which partly embarrassed his family, but also meant Henry could take all his assets and estates. The only other person we know in those early days who was actually charged under the Act specifically, the only one specifically charged under the Buggery Act, was Nicholas Erdell in 1541. Now, Nicholas Erdell was the headmaster at Eton Boys' School, and he was charged and had even admitted in a letter to inappropriate behaviour with the boys at Eton College. He was sent to prison with the intention of him being hung under the Buggery Act, but he appealed to a friend, the first Earl of Southampton, Henry Wriothesley, who interceded on his behalf and managed to get it converted to life imprisonment. He actually only served 1 year, was released. He went down to become headmaster of a school for the Southamptons for a while, and then eventually became headmaster of Winchester College. So it didn't seem that it made any difference in the long run. But there's no real other evidence. About a dozen cases seem to have then occurred inside the next 100 years. Very few people. All of that goes to indicate that this was an act almost entirely intended to be used as a weapon against the Catholic Church and to bring it down. The last people actually hung under this were James Pratt and John Smith, hung in 1835 and 1861. The Buggery Act was repealed and replaced by the offences against the person or sex. Anyway, I can't remember the name of the act now. It remained a capital offence in this country for a long, long time, right the way through till, say, 1861, when it was turned into a imprisonable offence, not a capital offence. Actual homosexuality remained illegal right up until 1967. I'll stop sharing that now. So right up until 1967, it still remained a capital, a punishable offence. And even in 1967, I remember this, I was 17 at the time, even then, it was still very, very nebulous, because the only way it was legal was if you were over the age of 21 and the acts take place in private. That means no one else in the building. And the courts interpreted this really, really severely. So because a lot of gay men were married, trans people as well, the only way to be able to see or have a relationship with somebody of the same sex was to do it in secret, do it in quiet. So you'd sneak into a small little hotel and take a room and somebody would join you there. But the hotels knew if this was happening, they could phone the police. The police would then pop round, wait until you basically got settled into the room, then burst in. And if you were in bed, you were going to be done. because even though it was decriminalized, it was only partially. If you were caught in a room, and what they said was, yeah, there are other people in the building. Okay, nobody else in the room. It was a severe interpretation. Took a long, long time before we got all this changed. And in fact, it was 2003 before we finally got rid of the last piece of, it wasn't the last piece, but the major, before it became illegal to discriminate against people because they're gay. 1999 for trans people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about law during next week. I'm going to look at the Equality Act and a whole range of different things. But anyway, that was my little Sunday, not my Sunday sermon, but just a little bit of an interesting look back. That the thing about the Buggery Act, of course, is that was the start of the golden age. By the time Elizabeth came to the throne, we then had Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh and everybody starting to search around the world, and we knew America existed. So the process of people going over to America, the Spanish were going over to South America, and this piece of legislation that the British had just put in place carried with the Brits as the British Empire expanded. So that legislation went with it. Okay, so I don't know what's happened there. I've got something suddenly jumped in with some noise. Anyway, hope you have a good day today. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I shall be back tomorrow at 4:00 when I shall be looking at. I think we're going to be looking at some of the Equality Act and some of the implications. I want to look more and more at what organisations can do to make the whole place LGBTQ and particularly trans friendly next week. So. Hope you enjoyed today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Let's find my brand. Okay, take care. See you tomorrow.